Thank you. And I'm very pleased to welcome you all to the Gift Stewards General Meeting, our session on tax transparency. This is a very important session because we are presenting a very important book and the tax principles. And we're going to give you a little bit of a background before we start. Gift tax principles, it's a long overdue task for us. The revenue side of fiscal equation has been neglected in terms of norms and guidance for public access to information. Although the high-level principles address the issue and also the public participation principles, it's true that we needed some very specific treatment on guiding governments and civil society for access to transparency on the revenue side, particularly tax policy and tax administration. In 2017, the Gift Stewards General Meeting, which was in Washington, by the way, back then, addressed the question. We devoted a long session to it. The World Bank was participating as much as the IMF. We had back then our tax expert, Jean Ross, and we had the pleasure to also have around the room Richard Murphy. 1 year later, in 2018, I went to the City University of London, invited by Richard Murphy and Andrew Baker, Professor Baker from University of Sheffield, to take part of the presentation of their work on tax spillovers. Back then, we all agreed that their work and method to assess spillovers could perfectly work to assess the transparency of the tax system. And actually, we agreed that tax transparency was needed to be addressed in any in-depth analysis of the tax system. And that was the origin of Making Tax Work, which final version is presented today. Meanwhile, of course, Gift civil society stewards and others were working on the topic. They were facing the challenges of access to information on the revenue side, and from different perspectives: equality, tax expenditures, tax administration, accountability, and others were working tax reform for a more just tax system. They were working on the topic. And here, of course, let me just name a few: IBP on tax expenditures, ISEFI on that, and also the justice of the tax system, CIEP from many perspectives. And by the way, ISEFI, based in Guatemala, although they work in all Central America, CIEP from Mexico. CIEP produced a paper on the transparency of the oil industry revenue in Mexico, also ASIG in Argentina, and INESC, among others, all well represented today in this session. And more recently, with IBP, the tax equity initiative of IBP, we produced a scoping paper about the needs of information of CSOs that are working on tax issues. So that's the general background of today's session. The objectives are to present the Gift book, Making Tax Work, a framework for enhancing tax transparency. After that, we will discuss the need of global tax principles on tax transparency for public access to tax information, with Faria presenting the specific approach of IBP and IBP network to the topic. And finally, Jean Gross will present on behalf of Gift the first version of the Gift transparency principles on tax policy and administration. We have a wonderful panel of people presenting and of people responding to the presentation, and I'm very pleased to have you around the screen this morning. So let us start with Professors Richard Murphy and Andrew Baker, today based both at the University of Sheffield, with the presentation of the book. And as we move forward in the session, I will be presenting many of you who very kindly accepted to respond to these three main pieces that we're going to start with: the making tax work, the work of IBP, and finally, the tax principles. Thank you very much. So, Richard, Andrew, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to do most of the talking, I think, on behalf of Andrew and myself. And the first thing to say is literally, thank you for asking us to talk about making tax work. It's fair to say that when Andrew and I began working on making tax work, we did wonder what the fuss was all about. We were mildly skeptical about the issue of tax transparency as a concept, because it was potentially ambiguous and lacking in substance. It's also fair to say that because of the work we've done, we now think that tax transparency is really important. And as a concept, we think it provides a way of thinking about tax and tax systems, both systemically and systemically, which has previously been absent. And that, if I wanted to summarize what we're going to say, is exactly it. It is a way of thinking. We see tax transparency as a dynamic evolutionary process. Making tax work reflects that understanding by suggesting methods that might help provide ways of increasing the available information about tax systems that can be used by the multiple tax stakeholders of those systems in a way that can develop over time. This systemic approach is, we think, important and is at the core of making tax work. Also at that core is the idea that Andrew and I share, which is that a functioning tax system is at the core of a functioning society. This is why we think it's so important that governments are as transparent and explicit as possible in stating the objectives they have for their tax system. This is especially important because tax is unlike any other administrative legal system. As well as having obvious implications for revenue raising, the arrangements around tax design, and the tax system have an enormous power to shape society, an economy, and to achieve public policy goals by shaping incentives, prices, the distribution of income and wealth, and so on. That makes tax an extraordinarily powerful tool that is available to any government to use. It's for this reason that we do actually place a lot of emphasis within making tax work on the goals that a government has, not just for revenue raise, but also on the kinds of society that the government wants to promote and the values and behaviors of the society that they wish to reflect inside their tax system. Being explicit and clear about these objectives is, we think, the starting point and underpinning for tax transparency. Without clarity about these objectives and hopes for the tax system, the question as to how that system is performing is difficult, if not impossible, to assess. A government sets its own success criteria in the process we lay out in making tax work. So in saying that, we put good governance at the heart of the tax system. But in doing so, we also turn tax transparency from being something that might have been prescriptive into something that is anything but that. Making tax works seeks to be comprehensive, but it is definitely not a how to do it manual. That would be too presumptuous, and it would also be wrong. Making tax work is instead built around the appraisal of systems against locally established goals. And that turns it into a how to think about it manual. It's in this context that we hope making tax work will become a reference work for those looking at how to create tax transparency in the very many and varying jurisdictions that it could be applied to around the world. We hope that's its relevance, and we make that the starting point for adaptation for local need. If there's a second dimension to that theme, it is that tax transparency is a public good. The information collection, delivery, scrutiny, and appraisal systems that constitute tax transparency that we lay out and discuss in Making Tax Work are intended to improve the functioning of a tax system and its capacity to serve and work for a variety of stakeholders. The intention is that tax transparency should help all of the stakeholders of a tax system in a jurisdiction to determine whether that system is being managed and used in a way that the government of the jurisdiction both intends and states as its purpose. That should then enable scrutiny and debate on the effectiveness and fairness of government tax policies. In short, tax transparency is and should be central to government accountability. So that's why we've defined tax transparency as a process. It is, in that sense, dynamic and hopefully progressive. We've tried to reflect that structure in our approach. We also think that approach has to be inclusive. As a result of some of the comments we received on the earlier draft at a meeting held in March, we've gone back and adapted that issue a bit. Tax transparency should increase the tax morale of a country and the faith and trust that the population has in the tax system. And that should in turn increase the willingness of a population to pay tax. But that requires involvement from civil society and business groups, as much as the engagement of a jurisdiction's tax authority. So those two groups now have their own distinctive chapters in the revised Making Tax Work, which is being presented today. And that's a big change in our thinking and the development in this process since March. That being said, we know that countries are in very different places when it comes to tax transparency. As a result, the recommendations that we make work through stages. We start at the most basic, where we suggest that there should be clear government accounting for taxes in total and that the basic data required to appraise tax issues is readily available, and move right through to the aspirational, where the performance of a tax system can be appraised against theoretically achievable standards and regular tax spillover assessments of the type that Juan Pablo has already referred to and which we have developed as a tool can take place. Now, we deliberately call that aspirational because we know that very few countries are there as yet, and in between the two we insert two other stages which we describe as intermediate and advanced, as more processes for delivering tax transparency are added into the system. The result is we think that almost any jurisdiction and its government could find Making Tax Work of use without finding it prescriptive at this moment. And we also include in that list of people who could find it of use, of course, civil society organizations as well, because they have a vital role in this process. As a consequence, we also think that because of this scope, Making Tax Work will, and this is our aspiration, have an appeal for major international organizations with an interest in tax, some of whom are represented here today, and to whom we might add the OECD. As Making Tax makes clear, tax is not just an issue of microeconomic concern. It's very much a part of the macroeconomic funding cycle of any jurisdiction, which is what makes it such a peculiar and important issue. To date, these two issues have been largely viewed distinctly. The OECD has, for example, focused heavily on the microeconomic management of tax. Nothing wrong with that, but others have looked at the macro dimension. And our hope is that the style of tax spillover appraisal that we suggest in Making Tax Work will reconcile these two dimensions to tax and provide an opportunity to review their interaction so that we can deliver the most effective tax system possible in the jurisdiction, which is, of course, essential for the well-being of everyone in it. That, again, is why we hope Making Tax Work might be a reference point. And that, I guess, is why Andrew and I are also so pleased that, as Juan Pablo has again just mentioned, GIFT have taken the ideas in Making Tax Work and are now developing them and making them their own. That's exactly what we hoped for. This is just a start point. It is for others to take and make their own. And that's why I'm looking forward to this discussion. But just before I hand back to the chair, I want to make sure that I've covered everything that Andrew wants to address. So I think we have a minute or two spare. Andrew, is there anything that you would like to add?
I was just going to add some concluding reflections. Obviously, today we've spoken at a higher level of generality about the general ideas of an intellectual framework behind making tax work, whereas in our last presentation in March, we went more into the detail and the specifics. So I just want to finish off with some concluding reflections. We live in a world where many public services are evaluated in terms of targets, objectives, and their performance more or less continuously. And it seems to us to be an anomaly that rarely, if ever, is that extended to the performance of tax systems, at least systematically as integrated entities, despite tax systems being the lifeblood of these other public services and being truly exceptional legal administrative systems in terms of their shaping society, as we recount in Making Tax Work, and Richard's just laid out. And in part, that's because tax can be politically difficult and contentious. And I think Making Tax Work does not deny the politics in tax. Indeed, it explicitly recognizes that different societies at different times will come up with very legitimate different answers as to how to best manage tax and what objectives should be prioritized in tax policy. But Making Tax Work does, however, call for transparency about those objectives, and indeed suggests such transparency is the very starting point and underpinning foundation for tax transparency more generally. Moreover, better tax governance requires evaluation of tax system performance in relation to those objectives, which of course is a much more technical exercise. And in a nutshell, that's the argument and central message of Making Tax Work. It suggests a variety of pathways for achieving that. It opens up ways of thinking about that. And as Richard suggested, it's not a recipe book. The challenges of climate change and post-pandemic inclusive recovery mean that tax system performance is going to be more important than ever. And the principles the GIFT team have drafted on the basis of Making Tax Work, and which this session will now move on to discuss, are an excellent starting point and precisely the kind of initiative we hoped Making Tax Work would provide a foundation for. And of course, those principles may in turn lay the ground for encouraging and enabling some of the more detailed requirements and forms of assessment Making Tax Work talks about. As authors, we look forward to participating in those further discussions about how to achieve in tax transparency. And we do hope, as Richard emphasized, Making Tax Work can act as a foundational departure point as a source of reference for that effort. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard and Andrew. We are very grateful for your contribution to our discussion and the production of a tool that is so ambitious, so rigorous, so comprehensive to assess tax systems from the perspective that we wanted to emphasize. So thank you. As you mentioned, we are just starting, and we are planning to have this discussion not only with such important stakeholders as the ones we have today, but also at country level with civil society, government officials, eventually legislatures, because we believe that this work needs to be tested, discussed before we have the final versions of the principles. We also thank you for producing the first version of the principles. It's true that the GIFT principles are based completely in your work, but we needed to own from now on the idea and the process. You will forgive us for that, but of course, now you are entitled to, and I ask you to be very critical about the principles, the version of the principles that we have produced. Thank you again. Let me now ask Faria, my dear colleague, Faria Mujahideen, my dear colleague from IBP, and a very hard, consistent worker on tax issues of many years, to present the background and the very specific research that IBP and partners have produced. Faria, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Juan Pablo. And so good morning, good afternoon. I think there are no good evenings, but I might be wrong. Thank you for joining us today. And for those of you who don't know me, yes, I am Faria Mohideen, and I'm the Senior Program Officer with the Tax Equity Initiative. And we have been working closely with GIFT over the last 18 months on revenue transparency from a civil society perspective. And I fear that if you were paying very close attention to what Richard was saying, he might have stolen my thunder, because I mean, it's all there. The question posed to me is, do we need global principles on tax transparency for public access to tax information? Which, in a way, the real question is, why do we as civil society, which is what we're reframing as the public, need these principles for tax transparency? And of course, it may not surprise any of you that my answer is, of course we need them. Yes, we need them. And the two key reasons for this need, which Richard anticipated, is, one, it means that the lack of comprehensive transparency standards mean that civil society or even regular citizens cannot access the information needed to engage in an informed assessment of their tax system or engage in an informed debate on tax policy and administration decisions. And of course, when there currently exists no comprehensive guidance or guidelines, there can be no clear starting point on where and how to meaningfully engage with revenue transparency, which is what a lot of our civil society partners are doing. They're trying to find the where and the how to meaningfully engage with revenue transparency. And so on this first point, there's a lack of comprehensive transparency standards. So I fear of repeating the excellent brief co-written by my colleague Pablo Dioenzio and also Juan Pablo. One of the key findings in our research is that existing standards and frameworks are fragmented, basic, their different standards cover different and sometimes overlapping topics and have disparate aims. But none of these standards put at the heart of their aims public engagement in decisions around tax policy and administration. And of course, you might ask yourself, why should the public, or in our interest, civil society organizations, engage in decisions around tax policy administration? As Richard said, tax is quite technical, not easy to understand, and it's not clear to most people what importance it may have to the layperson. But of course, as Richard mentioned, it can fundamentally shape and reshape societies and how equitable a society is and how equitable a society can be. And so comprehensive revenue transparency can tell us who benefits from the current tax system or proposed reform. And this requires some knowledge of who pays what, and relatedly, why they are paying that amount. This means governments must collect and share the data on who pays, who doesn't, and trying to estimate that cost of evasion. Without this knowledge, we as civil society cannot make, again, informed arguments, and that's the word I'm going to come back to, informed arguments about how to pursue equitable reforms that will close these gaps and loopholes in the tax system and make it more fair. And fairness is also an important issue now. As civil societies engage with their governments in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis, but also in the wake of dwindling donor funds that normally, in the past have funded development, the countries are now more and more relying on their own resources. And so in an attempt to broaden their tax net, fairness becomes a major concern of citizens who are being taxed. So if, comprehensive revenue transparency allows citizens to see and engage with their tax system and can encourage tax compliance. So this is a very important reason why civil society would care and want to speak or engage with governments on behalf of citizens. So let me then now come to the second reason, which speaks more to our experience in speaking with our CSO partners and in understanding their experiences in engaging around revenue transparency. So the second reason I stated was there currently exists no comprehensive guidelines or guidance that can provide a clear starting point on where and how to engage with revenue transparency. As I said, none of them address or have at their core the issue of meaningful transparency that can lead to meaningful engagement. And so here the word that I want to focus on is meaningful. We're not saying revenue transparency does not exist, but what we are asking is, does it serve the full range of stakeholders that are affected by the outcomes of fiscal policy debates? Does it make accessible the real issues at the heart of these fiscal policy debates? And often the answer is no. In partnership with GIF last year, we at IBP conducted a survey to ask CSOs working on domestic tax issues, what information do you really need to engage meaningfully with the government? And what barriers do you currently face in accessing that information? And so of course, and we see this in our in the case studies that we have also written with multiple partners. One of the biggest issues is the culture of secrecy on the revenue side, right? And this here I'm quoting directly from the brief. What this means is that because tax is seen as this severely technical issue, even government officials themselves have trouble on how to engage with civil society, engage with the public on disclosing this information. It's technical, it's secret, there's no way you can understand. And this comes back to the point of not knowing where and how to even begin engaging. And this is where the principles can help governments bridge that gap and also give our CSO partners a way to ask for this information and to make it less of an attack, but more of a partnership of, we will help you bridge this gap, this culture, to break open this culture of secrecy. The other issue is quality and accessibility of the data. A lack of availability, timeliness, granularity, or even the reverse. The data can be too noisy because of, you ask the government for data and it just comes in this dump. It's not in any shape or way or form to be able to be analyzed. This is also an issue because there are no guidelines or guidance. And then, of course, there's the kinds of information that are important. Often we heard from our CSO partners, sure, we have a good relationship with our government counterparts. They are giving us the information. However, we are completely lacking the information that is actually needed to engage the government in ways that can lead to equitable tax reform or equitable outcomes for society. So, these are things like lack of information on the tax incidents and tax impact on specific sectors or groups. Most places don't have good enough information on revenue administration performance, such as tax gap and their collection figures. And of course, one of the key issues that our global CSO scan, where we surveyed 170 organizations working on domestic tax issues across the world, is tax expenditures. This was the number one issue that CSOs were interested in. And this, of course, is the number one thing that they do not have good enough information about. And you don't know what you can't count, right? Or what you don't count and what you can't count. And so, although our CSO partner said, these are our issues, they were also quick to point out that their governments had no idea how to provide this information, where they themselves should begin in collecting and providing this data. They had no clue. So it was this acknowledgement that they also, CSOs themselves, saw themselves in a role to help governments provide this data. But in terms of looking for places of how to do this, these principles now provide us a good starting point. So this lack of consensus about what revenue transparency means, what it entails, among both governments and other actors, nor full clarity on how to promote transparency, participation, and accountability around these domestic tax issues are a key, this key gap is now being filled by these principles. So these new sets of principles, the hope is that they can help create, one, a common understanding between all stakeholders of what revenue transparency means and what it entails, provide a way for all stakeholders to engage in the debates on tax policy administration, and last but not least, create an environment for sustained, open, and inclusive engagement between government and citizens on tax issues. So thank you.
Bravo, Faria. Thank you so much. This sets perfectly the stage for our dear friend Jean Ross to present the first draft of this effort. We will discuss it more in depth with our lead stewards, including the IMF today very well represented, and the World Bank also very well represented. We will discuss it at country level. We will have an online public consultation. But the first opportunity is today. And Jean Ross has been a very good friend of IBP and of GIFT, but also, and I have to underline, a very good guide of IBP and GIFT on our tax work. So thank you. Jean, the floor is yours.
Thank you for that kind introduction. And it's really a pleasure to see some familiar faces. And it's been an honor to work with GIFT, I think, on this very important project. And the good news and the bad news about going third is the prior two speakers have done such a fabulous job at really making a lot of the points that would have liked to have made. And so I'm going to try to keep my remarks fairly brief so that we can move on and have a discussion, answer any questions, would welcome your feedback. The document before you has already been strengthened by questions that we've received from you. And so this really is an honest request to bring on points where we might have left something out, where we could be more clear, where there's a point that you might take some issue with as well. The prior two speakers have really spoken in a quite compelling way about why tax transparency matters, what's in the role of information on tax to improving not only tax systems, but also social and economic structures writ large. I'm not going to try to repeat that. I would just underscore everything that both Professor Murphy and Faria said, really wonderfully well put. And I think when we talk about taxes, the revenues that governments generate within themselves, within a country, and we really are talking about domestic resources here, I think could arguably be implicitly included within the broader fiscal framework that's addressed by GIFT's high principles on fiscal transparency, participation, and accountability. And I think the role of participation in tax decisions could arguably be considered an implicit part of GIFT's principles on participation in fiscal policy. And I think what Faria really began to touch on is the fact that there's a need for specificity in tax and a need for a roadmap that talks about what types of information are we talking about, at what level, who are the stakeholders that need to be engaged. And I think Professor Murphy really spoke to this. What's the broader context for the tax system? Because tax is so fundamental to everything that governments do and really how economies function, both globally and at the country level. And I think that what brought GIFT to understanding the need for these principles is that there needs to be something that acts more like a roadmap when we're talking about tax. And again, and I think Faria also spoke to this, I think in many cases, governments are just learning what information they need. Many governments, particularly in the global South, don't routinely do tax incidence analysis, don't do tax gap analysis. And so lifting up some of the analytic tools that can strengthen the tax system and make it more accountable is one of the goals of this set of principles before you. And I think, and as Juan Pablo said, the principles really build off of would not exist without the work of Professors Murphy and Baker, We owe a large debt to you. Thank you. They also owe a large debt to the work of GIFT and IBP's partners, including many of you, on this conference this morning. And really, it's your practice in the field and also your understanding of what you need to deepen that work that has informed the development of the principles that are before you for consideration. I think a theme that really emerges through that practice, to the survey that Faria mentioned in that, is the challenge of accessing basic information, accessing information that's understandable. And as somebody who spent a long time working on tax, a lot of times there's a lot of data out there, but it's not well described, it's not accessible, it's not contextualized in a way that makes it useful. And then there's putting tax within a broader fiscal framework in an economic context to understand what makes a fair tax system. You need to know what your income distribution looks like if you want to understand what your tax system looks like. What does your business sector look like? Is it corporations? Is it independent business people? You need to have that broader set of contextual information to really make sense and understand whether a country's tax system is right for that particular country. I think, and this really gets to one of the points, I think, in the principles that was greatly improved by prior feedback. And Professor Murphy started out by saying that tax transparency is ambiguous. And I think as we drafted these, sort of grappled with that, it was actually a question from Mihaela that really helped sharpen that point and helped me understand that one of, I think, the most important potential roles of these principles is precisely to give us a definition of what transparency is. And the question was, but where do we define what is transparency? And it was at that point that I realized, in many ways, what the principles are designed to do is to give us a working definition that can function as a roadmap for civil society trying to hold governments to account, and for governments trying to strengthen and deepen their own tax systems, and for also understanding the different relationships within government. Tax administrators that are part of the executive branch and the legislative branch that makes the laws and also acts as a check and balance within government. A few closing comments, and then we'll look forward to the panel and your questions on the principles. The principles are designed to be interdependent, but they're also intended to work on their own as individual points. And I think, there's a lot in there. And when you read Making Tax Work, you realize just how complicated, and really, again, to develop the systems within government, that this is going to take some time to implement in most places. And I say that as somebody who probably comes from a country with well-developed tax systems. There's a lot that we would need to do in the US to meet these standards. And it may be that different countries, different civil society organizations want to focus on one or two or a limited number of the principles and work towards improving practice in those areas and then moving on to the other ones. And no system is perfect, but I think the value of a network like GIFT is to information share. I think there's a tremendous role for the IMF, some of the work that the World Bank has done through the TADAT measures and other sort of mechanisms designed to help government improve their systems, information sharing. Some of the information we're talking about really does need to be situated in a regional context. And I think that also brings in the role for multilateral organizations as well. I think this is an incredibly important process, and I think I'll close by going back to something Professor Murphy said at the outset of his remarks, and that a functioning tax system really is at the core of a functioning society. And if we want to have a well-functioning and accountable tax system, it needs to be a transparent one. So thank you.
Thank you, Jean. And thank you for devoting so much time and so much iterations for this first final version of the principles. And there you have them. Now let's hear from you, dear colleagues. We need to really start perfectioning and enriching this first draft with your comments. Let me invite to start with the comments Alex Clem from the IMF. Thank you, Alex, because you were in our first meeting. Your comments were very useful. And thank you again for taking part of the summertime to be with us today. Please, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Juan Pablo. Let me start by congratulating GIFT as well as the authors of the background paper for a really impressive amount of work that will really be super helpful for the agenda of improving tax transparency. So I don't have much time here, but I want to make 3 very quick remarks. My first is really on the current situation. So tax transparency is always important. I take that point, but I think now is a great moment to push it, because at this time, countries, depending on the state they're in, they have to implement either fiscal stimulus, or they have to raise revenue to recover costs post-pandemic, or sometimes they may have to do both, either at the same time or shortly after one another. And some of these measures are very controversial. So then in order to assess them, it will be incredibly important to have full transparency to allow everyone to assess them. And this will either mean that people will understand the measures and accept them, or if they turn out not to have been good ones, at least one can learn lessons for the future and avoid pitfalls that were done in the rush of the moment. Either way, tax transparency is key for these things. My second point that I want to make is about the IMF supporting tax transparency. It's something that is really important to the IMF. Maybe some of you know that we have been doing fiscal transparency codes and fiscal transparency evaluations for a long time, and there was even a predecessor product. We also have a very active program on tax expenditure assessments, not only producing numbers for countries, but teaching them how to do these numbers. And I think this will fit really nicely into the guidelines that you have produced, because tax expenditure are a very important component of that. And then finally, we also try to facilitate the cross-country material by producing data such as the world revenue statistics. Finally, I want to make the point that we are also a great user of data. So from that perspective, we also absolutely welcome tax transparency. And it helps us also both in our surveillance and in our capacity development for 2 countries. And sometimes we have access to data even when they are not published, but I don't want to have, my own access. It's much better if they are publicly available, because that can lead then to a discussion with stakeholders, and that can improve really our advice and everybody else's comments. So I think my time is up with that, Juan Pablo. Many thanks for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Alex, for keeping in time and for making such important points. Now, colleagues, this has been made possible thanks to the World Bank. This is a project that is worked on in partnership with their sponsorship and within the World Bank. I have to say that our best friend and ally has been Stephen Davenport. Thank you. Who is in the middle of his vacation, if I understand correctly, taking some time of family and vacation time to be with us. Thank you so much, Steve. The floor is yours.
As always, Juan Pablo, I'm always so embarrassed by your compliments. Thank you. Hey, Faria, good to see you. Good to see you all. So unfortunately, my colleague Anna is unavailable, and my colleague Roel is on paternity leave, so you're stuck with me. I'll be quick. Just to give the big picture, I'm the global lead for open government at the bank, so I've done a lot of work in fiscal transparency. So clearly there was a gap. So if you talk about why the bank is doing this, it's for a lot of the reasons you're talking about. It's this is a gap in what is tax transparency, first of all, who's involved, why is it important? We all know implicitly that transparency is good, but let's unpack that a bit. So a lot of this investment was with Richard and Andrew and Juan Pablo was to unpack this a bit so that we could frankly use it in our conversations with the clients, with the governments, because as you know, we do a lot of work on DRM. Transparency is a hot topic, especially in tax. It's much easier in procurement and budget now, but that's for a reason, because Gift and IBP have been working on this for a long time and creating the market for that. So we need to do the same thing for tax. So that's really the overarching ambition here. And what is the role of civil society in that conversation? Because that's very unclear. And who do we work with if we want to do this? Because Gift has created a network. Procurement, there's different communities we can talk to and NGOs, but what is the population of people that we can bring into the conversation on tax transparency? So that was part of it. So create literature and research, figure out who to talk to, and get the conversation going globally on this. We also have TDAT, which was mentioned, and what does transparency really mean in that context? Because TDAT is a big, huge instrument that usually gives a lot of criticism, but what are the recommendations to do next? And transparency might be one of those outputs. And then, as some of you might know, we were doing some work on innovations in tax compliance, which is providing some resources for this, and that's how do we bring in non-technical drivers into this discussion. So TDAT has been criticized for being overly technical when in fact it's political. And there's a lot of issues around so this will be connected to that work as well, because we're calling it EFT, enforcement, facilitation, and trust, and what is trust all about? And we unpack trust, and we use some of the words you're using today, which is the system fair? Is it equitable? Is reciprocity happening? Is there accountability? So this fills in a lot of transparency as a piece of that. So this is very helpful. And again, principles, we've used these before. So we've used the gift participation principles. We've used the fiscal transparency principles with our governments as a basis of conversation for lending, frankly. So we need these principles because now we have a global yardstick to use to put this on the table for them, because it's globally recognized and others are doing it. And here's what it looks like, and you need to be doing it too. So these principles are very useful for us. But in a few comments that you might want to consider, given the reality of what I've seen, is a lot of how you guys know this better than I do because I'm not a tax expert. But federal tax is one thing, subnational is another. It's very different across countries. So if you're talking property tax, you need to apply these principles at the state level in Nigeria. Federal is different. So that nuance is important. It's especially important if we want to operationalize this. So in what categories are we talking subnational and what categories are we talking federal? We need to be doing it in both. Let's do these principles travel well across states? Don't know. Think about that. Internal use. So we have a big issue between just customs talking to the tax authority. Like transparency helps internally. It's not just CSOs we're talking about in the public. It's about, and one of the theories, and Faria knows this, that we have is that if you table the issue of transparency and data sharing you test political will, right, internally, right? So if they're not willing to be transparent among themselves, there's an issue. And if they are serious about it, then maybe we can do some of these reforms in a serious way. But using this transparency tool as a test of political will is good. And getting customs to talk to tax authority has a lot of wins, just at a very basic level, but it doesn't happen. Why is that? And how do we get it to happen? So this instrument can help with that. I think I heard it, but we talk about accountability a lot in advocacy, but we really do need to get to collaboration and engagement with CSOs around tax issues, and ex ante, not ex post. So like Nigeria is a good example. They want to raise, Kaduna and other states want to raise tax rates. Tax rates are ridiculously low in Nigeria, inappropriately low, but we don't know how much we can raise them without the public screaming. The public is going to scream anyway, right? Because nobody wants to pay taxes, but how far can we go? Can we engage civil society and the public in advance on what tax rates might be acceptable and what won't? So, we can talk about the ex post accountability, hold them to account, but also how do we use it as a conversation with government? I think it was mentioned in some of these discussions on collaborations versus just hardcore accountability. And then lastly, and you know this as well as I do, because we did this in open data and fiscal transparency, is what is the economic value of it? Until we get to the economic value of it, we're still a little soft in terms of our argument, right? Especially when governments are faced with COVID, educational, health concerns, they want to borrow for that with us. The transparency thing is just an extra, and it's sometimes problematic. So how do we make an economic argument for it such that they make it a priority? And that's what we've done with open data and budget transparency and procurement transparency, but now we need to do the same in tax. Like, what is the value for government that is got teeth or an edge that they need to raise more revenue, to communicate more effectively? Sometimes it's as simple as they're recognized in the global community as being a leader, a regional leader, what have you. But start to think about some of the edgier issues around tax transparency. And I understand that takes time and we need to fill in the research for that. But that's what we did with budget transparency, and that's what we did with procurement transparency, and that's what we did with public participation, as we slowly built the case based on metrics and such. Anyway, that was a little longer than I wanted, but that's kind of why we're doing this and what we hope to use these tools for very practically with our clients, right? And how do we engage civil society in addition to that, which is we're not the best at that. So we need help with that, to be very frank. So over.
Thank you. Thank you very much for those very important points, Steve. And one of the last points about the value of this for governments takes me to our tax authority representative in this panel from South Africa, Marley van Meekerk. Thank you very much for making the time.
Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to maybe share some ideas, but moreover, for all the work that's gone into this. I think I am sufficiently inspired, challenged, if not intimidated, in my quest to maybe live up to these principles that you have. I thought maybe just from my perspective, the biggest value I can see for a project of this nature is that it actually offers protection, even to government officials, which is often overlooked. Apart from the fact that better informed populace can have better informed discussions about policy design. Transparency helps us to avoid the worst mistakes. So when they are perfectly clear, they also get fixed. So that is a very important protection mechanism for a public official like me. Moreover, it actually injects a good dose of neutrality, because when there are facts, one can discuss the facts rather than a lot of people's different opinions. And even those small points, I think, would be of incredible value in improving the quality of tax policy making. I guess also in the process of one of the things that a lot of people are worried about in the process of setting policy is that it could get captured by certain lobby groups, because taxes that, or the lack of taxes that benefit a narrow group of taxpayers are actually very hard to roll back, because you've got a vocal minority and there's no reason for the majority to speak up against those. Whereas information of this nature actually widens up the discussion so that it can become clear how preferential tax treatment is benefiting a narrow group. So in my view, that is a benefit. Perhaps the one thing I wanted to just mention is, for a lot of domestic jurisdictions, and tax is always jurisdictional, there's an emerging tension between legislation that attempts to open up the access to information. And in South Africa, at least I can say, we have legislation of that nature that compels an official like me to respond to any request for information. And on the other hand, the protection of personal or private information. And that is, I think, an important angle to also just bring into this discussion. And it goes to Faria's point about what information should be available, how it should become available, and at what level. In which cases is it appropriate to aggregate information, and in which cases should they be at sort of like the most micro level that they could possibly be? It's a difficult question. We've been grappling with it as we've been making more information available. And all of the information that we have access to is anonymized because it's only the tax administration that can identify taxpayers. But for public policy discussion, there's a question to which extent taxpayers should be identifiable in any data set. So those are practical concerns, but they have a big impact on how valuable it would be. But perhaps the last point that relates to this is that, well, the electronic filing systems that some countries are rolling out actually helps to get more information, to make it available, to aggregate it, to analyze it. But I think one should always remember they are collected for a very specific purpose. And therefore, tax information from a tax database is not going to give you the same information as, say, for instance, the system of national accounts and the total that you'll get for the income of the country, for instance, because we are interested in taxable income. And making comparisons between the two is actually not that simple. So getting some level of conformity between these different sets of data sets would be, well, academically, I think, challenging on the one hand, but a very interesting way of approaching it to see how tax fits into the broader scope of economic data that we use in our systems. But this data doesn't come free. It comes at a cost, and that cost is actually to the taxpayer. So as much as we want to improve the level of data that's available, it imposes a compliance cost. So getting that balance right will evolve over time. And maybe that's the final thing I want to say. As much as tax differs between different countries, it also evolves over time. And transparency in that timeline helps us to evaluate whether we are improving or not. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias, Marley. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marley.
Let's now move on to our tax experts for a long time from civil society. And we start with Mexico. Hector Siep.
Thank you very much, Juan Pablo. I'm honored to be here. The book is really nice. I'll be super brief given the time constraint. First, I like very much I like very much the systemic approach that the book is presenting. Many times when we think about fiscal transparency, it's like the revenue expenditure part. It's lovely that the book insists you need to have objectives for a tax system and you have to have performance measurements. I think that's a very nice contribution. Second point, some years ago, there was like this very influential book, Tax Systems by Slamroth and Gilitzer, I believe that now Murphy and Baker are providing an operational guide for tax systems. And this is really good and important. Thirdly, I would like to pick up in one of the points by Alexander Clem. We are discussing nowadays a lot of sustainable development goals, but this financing of the sustainable development goals has not been that well connected to tax systems and how we are financing that at a national level. In that sense, this book provides a very important guideline. I believe that in the coming years, there will be a lot of work by GIFT. I congratulate you for this, and let's keep in that direction. There's a lot of work to do there, and it's very important nowadays, given what has happened with COVID. I will stop there, Juan Pablo. Many thanks.
Thank you, Hector. And thank you for focusing on making tax work. That was also very useful. And let me now go to an organization who has working this topic from the justice standpoint, from the progressive and equitable concerns of tax systems. In the case of Brazil, Nathalie Benin, thank you.
Hello. Thank you, Juan Pablo. Hello to all of you. It's better than good morning, good night, good afternoon, because I'm not sure where you all are. Just 3 points, Juan Pablo. First of all, this is a great job, amazing job. Congratulations to what you are doing. It is very important to have those standards. So I'm very happy with that. The second point is, as you know, we always ask the question, transparency and accountability for what? Because we don't believe it can be neutral. Our tax systems are very political. They reflect the power relations between that are in the country. So I don't believe a transparency proposal can be neutral. So as you know, we always defend the idea of human rights, because most of our countries, at least in the region, have to subscribe international norms regarding human rights. So for us, this must be the purpose of the tax system, and transparency and accountability should be directed in that sense. And the third point is, I wanted to share with you, I know that you already are aware of that, is the initiative we discussed for at least 2 years, 7 organizations from the Americas. And we have 2 organizations here. I see Julieta is there and ENG. We elaborated the principles for human rights in fiscal policy. And of course, we have specific recommendations for tax systems. So I would really recommend, I will put the link in the chat, but I would really recommend that you have a look at this document, because it was built in a civil society perspective, but we had the apports of specialists in tax systems. So I think it would be a good input for the principles. Thank you.
Thank you for very important points, and for welcoming this effort too. With you from ENG, we have Carmela. It's good to see you, Carmela. We will have a chance to open up and have everyone contributing to our discussion. But if I follow the order of our agenda, it is time now to ask Mihaela Bronic from the Institute of Public Finance in Croatia to take the floor. Mihaela, you help us redefining a couple of issues before time. So I start by thanking you for your careful reading of the draft we first shared. To you now.
Thank you, Juan Pablo. Hello, everybody. Well, I wanted first to thank everybody for working on this topic, because I'm sure that it will be useful for all of us, as many of you told that before of me. I was reading the principles and I have actually 4 comments. They might be useful. Firstly is that I didn't see, but maybe I was not reading well, whenever it says that the government should publish some data, for example, in the principle 6 and in the later in this principle 8, I think we could add that it should be in machine readable format, because for researchers and maybe also for citizens, everything else is not very usable. I think it could be useful. Second thing is actually regarding the principle number 6, government should publish an accounting of taxes collected. And it crossed my mind when I was reading this that how detailed should this be? And this was already mentioned by Faria and by Marlet. For example, I'm not sure should this be written here, but maybe we could think about that. For example, should this should government only publish the data for each tax separately, or do we need the data for each tax payer? For example, in our institute, we are usually using microsimulation models for analysis of taxes and benefits, and actually we need the data on the personal level. They are anonymized. Usually we get it from the tax administration, as the lady from South Africa already said that they are doing the same thing. But it would be enormously useful if this data would be publicly published. For example, I think that maybe we should think here on how detailed in this principle 6, how detailed should this data be, the publishing of this data. Or maybe that is not for principles, I'm not sure. Another point is who should publish this, and this was actually also mentioned before me, but I think that maybe it should be written that both general government as well as regional and local governments should publish this data. And also, there is one point that in Croatia we have a problem. For example, the major tax in Croatia for local government is a personal income tax, and it's shared with central government. And the problem is that nowhere it is explained how this sharing goes, actually. So there is a problem from the local government side, not from the citizens, so much that the local governments don't understand how this sharing goes in detail. So maybe, so if there is tax sharing mechanisms, I think that there is also need to for these mechanisms to be explained very detailedly. This is like one of the information too. And finally, I just wanted to say that when I was looking, since I could not define what tax transparency was, I was looking on the internet, and I found that OECD is already using term tax transparency, but is in somehow little different context. They defined it as putting an end to bank secrecy and tax evasion through global tax cooperation. And actually, the main point is exchange of information. So maybe just somewhere here, it could be written that the OECD is also having the same definition, but it is used for some, it is not totally the same as the one used here. I'm not sure. Maybe it might be useful. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Michaela from the Institute of Public Finance, and Katarina, always a colleague of hers, always complain that we call them to these discussions and say, but we're not experts, but I rest my case. You have given us wonderful, wonderful comments and suggestions, and you are very modest. You do are experts, and we thank you for your time and for your investment on this. Let me now go, as you know, we have English, Spanish in this session, y ahora, con mucho gusto, doy la bienvenida
And now I will kindly welcome Julieta. Thank you, Juan Pablo. Well, I am going to speak Spanish, so please use interpretation. Well, undoubtedly, I think the principles will enrich our debates, and they're going to be a great tool for civil society to demand better data that allow us to monitor task systems and have better participatory reforms. And this is what all of these organizations that Natalie was mentioning are working for. So I applaud this work, I welcome this work, and I congratulate you. And I also think this meeting for input suggestion, I think it is very important to complement the principles with human rights principles in fiscal policy. And I would add a reference to the Principle 7 on production and access to relevant fiscal information or tax information. And among these guidelines, I think the need to limit the application of the bank secrecy, which is highly used to fiscal institutions in order to limit access to information in our countries, and also to generate information systems that allow to run updated analysis, and also the incidence of different tax payment groups, populations with disaggregated information by gender, race, language, ethnicity. And in addition to mentioning these principles, I would suggest to incorporate two things, which, if I understand, they could derive from the document. They could be incorporated more explicitly in order to work as one more tool for the civil society. And I think that the first one would be the commitment to produce information on the incidence of taxes by level of income in order to know how much every individual contributes to the tax system. And secondly, a concrete reference of tax expenditure. This is something very opaque, very not very dealt with in our region, and we need to talk about more about this. So it is important to include this and include concrete commitments on the need to approve tax expenses with transparency, with clear, measurable goals, publish detailed information on cost. And we're seeing that the level of regulation and obligations on tax and budgetary expense is more robust than for tax expenditure. And well, that's what I wanted to add. So thank you very much for inviting me and for giving me this space. Thank you, Julieta. It is very relevant, what you just mentioned. And to our interpreters, thank you very much for your exceptional work. So tax expenditure is gasto tributario, so that's the right term. And the
Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, Center on Budget and Policy Priorities has been working for a very long time on tax equity and transparency issues, and it is an honor to have you, Chuck, giving us your remarks on this work. Welcome.
Thank you, Pablo. Yeah, just a couple of points briefly. Yeah, on the principles look very good to me. I think if there's a way to incorporate in them some sense of the importance of how they're implemented, and it's an iterative process, right? I think if you think about the United States, we're in the midst of a really intense tax debate right now, and U.S. could easily check the box on, say, the tax gap one, right? We periodically put out information on the tax gap, but if you look at it, what the U.S. does is they put it out very irregularly, every few years. There's no schedule. It's somewhat incomplete, and it's not on a annual basis, right? But on an annual basis, we put out every year the tax gap portion for the lowest income people. So as a result, a lot of the audit attention, enforcement attention goes to very low income people. So it's very distorted. So you could say, well, we check the box, but really don't check it very well. So I think the sense of sort of constant improvement is very important. And just one specific, I think it's very important on the tax expenditure side, information on that. We do that, I think, reasonably well, and it's very helpful here. But also, I think it's helpful on the taxes paid too, to do similar amount, like who's paying the taxes. Because in the US, what happens a lot is wealthy people will hide a lot behind farmers, right? In the sense that any tax on wealthy people, that get a sense that farmers are paying.
Sorry, Chuck, Can I interrupt you for a second? Our translators to Spanish are having a bit of an issue to hear you well.
Okay.
If you could get closer probably to your microphone.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Thank you.
And
there you
Chuck,
go.
maybe,
thank you very much.
Maybe if you could also, sorry for this, speak a little bit slower, that would also help.
I'm sorry. Yeah, time is tight. Okay. So just
we'll
to repeat,
give you an extra couple of minutes.
I'm sorry. Worry. Yeah, I'm from New York. So anyway, yes. So just to repeat on the tax gap, this and for the principles overall, I think when implemented, I think they're terrific. But I think that it would be helpful to put in there some sense that dynamism and constant improvement, right? Because again, the U.S. could meet certain standards, but it doesn't necessarily meet them very well, right? We have a very distorted reporting on the tax gap, that we have reporting on high income people every few years, but on low income people, there's reporting every single year. And that distorts the tax compliance process for us. And then on the principle, I think it's a very helpful principle on tax expenditures, right? I think it's very important to know who's benefiting from tax preferences, but I think it's also good to know who's paying certain taxes, right? And just an example, as mentioned in the US, a lot of taxes on high income people, when we go to raise them, what high income people groups, wealthy people will often argue is that it will hurt farmers, right? And there's this sense that farmers pay this disproportionate amount, right? Very sympathetic group, right? And one needs to have information to debunk these claims. Otherwise, the debate gets very distorted. So apologies again, but I'll stop there.
Nothing to apologize for. On the contrary, thanks for your time. You mentioned you are from New York. Nobody's perfect. What a privilege. Lovely city. Thank you, Chuck, for your patience. And now we finish with Ricardo Barrientos. And we finish, and then we'll open up for a few minutes that we have left the floor for our presenters to respond, and of course, others who might have a question. Let me ask for your patience and indulgence to extend the session for 10 minutes today. Ricardo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I will speak in Spanish, but I would like to start congratulating GIFT for its 10th anniversary. So congratulations, it's now 10 years. Unbelievable, time runs very fast. Así que cambio a español.
So I am going to switch to Spanish now. Due to the fact that time flies, I have very clear and concise comments. I would like to congratulate GIFT for their effort for these principles on this issue of tax transparency. And I agree with Michael in the sense that we are missing an effort to unify the concepts because, and there could be some political issues. For instance, in Guatemala, when we're talking about this issue, we think about OECD and the sanctions for not complying to the standards. So I think we are coming to a more amplified concept, a deeper concept. And I would like to acknowledge that I like a lot the first principle. We have to insist on the fact that access to public information is a right. And just as it is drafted, I think principle 1 is wonderful. And this is the right first step. We have to understand and recognize that the right of men and women and all individuals to access information that should be public is basic, is crucial. And in Guatemala, tax information, individualized tax information is classified as confidential under the Constitution. So it is important to understand that this is not about violating the privacy of individuals, which in the case of my country is part of the individual guarantees. But tax information should be of public domain. And another important comment was that the issues of tax transparency have very important political implications in that taxing is one of the society-state relationships that are most relevant. And in that sense, I think tax transparency has direct implications in the credibility and the trust people have in their government. And at times, even more than transparency, when we're talking about public debt, why is that? Because when a government is doing things well, they have credibility, they have legitimacy, and tax transparency is not such a clear need. But when a country or when a government is known for cases of corruption, then people do not trust. And unfortunately, where we see the most important problems is when governments want to create tax policies. When a government is having corruption issues, then taxing is more complex. In that sense, Principle 13 is very important, especially when one reads that the governments should relate to their citizenship, to civil society organizations and other sectors when they are designing public policy as regards taxing. And there are governments that think that this is not necessary, that tax reforms are designed behind closed doors without the need to interact at all with the citizenship or with the public. So I think this principle is very strong, and I think there will be some resistance. And at last, I would like to underline the importance of Principle 8, as some of the participants already mentioned, the differentiated tax treatments, tax exemptions, tax breaks, incentives, or privileges, tax privileges, are at the core of the agenda, and they create tension because these differentiated treatments are in reality tax mechanisms that discriminate, that are supposed to be justified, yet these are violations to the principle of generality. If we make exceptions to generality by means of an incentive, then this has to be twice as transparent. So Principle 8 is at the core of the agenda of what should be transparent, because these discriminatory treatments should be justified and very, very transparent. So these are my comments. My congratulations for this first publication. Thank you very much, Jose Ricardo, for your comments, with are underlining the areas where some tension and resistance may be faced and some of the challenges ahead. And well, we want this effort to be recognized by the governments, by the civil society and other relevant stakeholders on the international level. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your very useful comments. And now we will open the discussion, although we have only a few minutes left. So I am going to pass the floor to our presenters who may already have some questions or reactions in the pipeline. So Andrew, Richard, Faria, Jean, and I think we will have a few minutes left for any comments from our public. Thank you. Richard, Andrew, back to you.
Hi, may I jump in with three very quick reactions to what I've heard? Thank you everyone for your comments, incredibly helpful. But already, I repeat, I think this process has to develop, and I'm hearing things here that are saying we could go further. Three issues. One, I really like the comment that this protects public officials. I think that's really helpful. But it also immediately jumped out to me that would help us to codify perhaps in more depth. I mean, there was only so much time to work on this project to date. but there's more we could do. What is that basic information that should be produced? Now, I'm a chartered accountant. I believe in accounting standards, and I believe they're principles-based, but also flexible to cover a lot of situations. I believe we could provide a lot more guidance on what that information is. I think, secondly, that's key to one of the other issues that came out, and I think we heard this very clearly from the IMF, that comparability is a key issue here. I've used a lot of the data that the IMF and others in the CUSP and so on produce, and one of the big problems in data at present is the real problem of comparability between states that makes it very hard to use some of that information. I almost have this feeling, and I'm afraid this is the chartered accountant in me coming out, that there's a need for an accounting standard here for how government should be reporting this information, that it could be really helpful to have some models. We looked at some of that in Making Tax Work, but I think there needs to be more. My third point, and again, this is a different theme, CSOs. I mean, I come to this issue. I was a tax campaigner. I still am a tax campaigner in some senses. And CSOs are critical to this whole engagement process. I think that's true. But we need to work out how do we train people to use this data? What does it do? There's some of that in Making Tax Work as a pathway to indicate that that's what we want out of this. But I think, again, that's an issue for development over time. So I believe those are three really important reactions to what I've heard, but all issues we can develop and take forward. Thank you very much for your comments.
Thank you, Richard. Andrew.
I'll make a very quick comment, and I apologize for the noise outside my window.
No problem.
I think super helpful. I've taken a lot of notes. Would encourage those of you who didn't get a chance to speak to email your questions and comments as well. I think what we have now, and one of the tensions that I think came out to me as I listened to the panel is we have a 5-page document and we have a 150-page document, and there needs to be something between the two that begins to elaborate on questions like what format data is made available. Absolutely agreed that machine readable is key to usability. I'm not sure whether that goes in a high level principle or not. I think some of Chuck's point about the need to look not only at income or sector, but income and sector together is key. And I think there is a level of elaboration that's maybe in the 15 to 20 page version rather than the 150 page that can really begin to address some of the points that all of you raised. And if there are points and specific issues that are key for your work, would welcome hearing that.
Thank you, Jean. I follow you on your kind invitation to have everyone to send us those comments and to follow up with us. We'll be happy to continue the conversation with you. And as you know, or probably know, we will have a general discussion of the stewards on the principles this upcoming Friday. Faria, final comments from you, if you please. Thank you.
Right, and it's because I do have to run to next meeting. But I mean, the thing that really, I mean, thank you, everyone. Fantastic comments, fantastic considerations, and just, you know, a high level of engagement with not only what we present, but the principles themselves. One of the things that really jumped out to me, and that I've been actually turning over in my head, is something that Stephen said about how transparency can also lead to a test of political will, not only between governments and citizens, but also within government. And I think, you know, I'm really reflecting on what our CSO partner said to us, is that often, even in very tough environments with closing civic space or tight civic space, they have managed to always find someone within government that's been friendly. And one of the things that has, you know, CSO partners have said, like, sometimes we need to find ways to make it easier for our champion within government to do this work, and to help them, you know, these principles can then be the thin end of the wedge with which we can arm our government champions, to further this agenda in a political way within government. And I think that's actually a use that I hadn't really thought of until Stephen mentioned it. And I think that is actually something very important in how CSOs can approach this advocacy, these insider-outsider strategies, which is something we cover in our case studies. And so I'm really excited, and I said this to Juan Pablo privately as well, I'm very excited to see what we can do with these principles across all these different kinds of stakeholders, across all these kinds of levels of government, once these gain traction and get put into use. So, and thank you, Juan Pablo, for giving me the opportunity to present at this session.
Thank you very much, Faria, for your contribution to our discussion. Andrew, would you like to take the floor? You were kicked off, maybe. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I was kicked off. Yeah, and so I only heard a little part of what Richard said, which I may cover something he said. And the one thing I did want to say was in response to Mihaela when she was talking about definitions of tax transparency, because at the front end of making tax work, we spend quite a bit of time defining tax transparency as a public good, and deliberately differentiating that definition from the OECD definition. And in a way, making tax work is about saying the OECD definition of tax transparency is kind of half a definition of tax transparency, maybe a third of a definition. And actually, there's a whole series of things relating to the information government should be making available. And it's there that we try to shine a light on in making tax work, and fill in the other half of the definition that is needed in relation to tax transparency, which is as a responsibility and obligation on governments, which can also work to their advantage as a process, which is part of the logic and rationale that I think is written large throughout the document Making Tax Work, that we don't see this as being a threat to governments, but something that actually helps them to get a better sense of how they're performing, and to enhance the policy dialogue around the functioning of the tax system as a whole.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew. Let me ask around the room if we have any pressing comment. Anyone would like to take the floor for any point that you believe needs to be recorded by us? Well, if no one is absolutely pressed to add to this very rich discussion, let me stress out that this is to be continued. This week we're having another discussion on the principles. Hopefully this version of the principles will allow us to start or continue the discussion that I mentioned, that is going to be a process, and hopefully sometime soon we will all agree on a consensus set of principles that address many of the very important points that you have made. Thank you for your support, but also for your critical, honest reading, view, and suggestions for the principles. I wish you a wonderful evening, afternoon, morning, and we'll see you around this week at the Stewards General meetings. Muchas gracias. Have a great day. Bye-bye.